The sound hit Garrett Coyle before the light did a low, shuddering boom that rattled the slats of the supply shed and sent the stacked grain sacks sliding. He was on his feet with the rifle before the second tremor faded, boots already laced because he hadn't unlaced them in 3 days, not since the generator went sideways and sleep became something he negotiated with rather than enjoyed. Outside, the sky over the Vale Steppe was wrong. A column of pale fire hung above the eastern ridge, 2 kilometers out, maybe less. Not lightning. Lightning didn't hold still. This held, wavered, then collapsed like a building folding inward, and the boom that followed was deeper, a pressure against his chest rather than a sound in his ears. Smoke rolled across the scrubland, and something inside it was burning with a color he had no name for, not orange, not white, something between violet and heat itself. He chambered around out of habit, knowing it was useless against whatever had just fallen from orbit. Garrett Coyle was 47 years old, a former combat engineer with the Terran Frontier Corps who had retired to this outpost because he wanted distance from anything that required him to chamber rounds. The steppe was supposed to be quiet. Mineral survey station, automated mostly, 1 human on rotation to keep the solar array from silting over and to file quarterly reports nobody read. 11 months he'd been here. 11 months of wind and dust, and the particular silence of a man who had chosen to subtract himself from the equation of other people's lives. He went toward the fire anyway. The wreckage was smaller than he expected. Not a ship, a pod. Egg-shaped, split along one seam like a fruit dropped from too high. The hull was a material he didn't recognize, something that looked like ceramic and smelled like copper when it burned. Pieces of it lay scattered across a 50-meter radius, still ticking with residual heat, and the scrub grass had been scorched flat in a perfect circle around the impact point. He heard the sound before he saw the source. A thin, high keening, barely above the register of the wind. Not mechanical, biological. Garrett circled the split pod and found her on the far side, pressed against the hull fragment as if trying to climb back inside something that no longer existed. She was small, smaller than he'd expected anything to be inside a vessel that size. Her skin was the color of rain-washed slate, smooth and faintly luminous where the firelight caught it. Her eyes were enormous, not human-large, but structurally different, pupils that expanded and contracted in rapid pulses like a camera struggling to focus. Pointed ears, fine as paper, pressed flat against her skull. Silver hair matted with something dark that might have been fluid from the pod or from her. She wore the remnants of a garment that had once been structured stiff fabric with metallic threading, now torn and hanging from one narrow shoulder. She was holding something against her chest, a small object clutched so tightly her fingers had gone white at the knuckles. Garrett couldn't make it out in the firelight. He lowered the rifle, set it on the ground, took 2 steps back so she could see his hands were empty. The keening stopped, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity. It was assessment. She was measuring whether he was the next threat or a gap between threats, and her body was coiled to run even though she clearly couldn't. Her left leg was bent at an angle that suggested it had taken the impact badly, and she was putting no weight on it at all. "Easy," he said. The word meant nothing to her. He said it anyway because it was the only word he had for this. He knelt slowly, one knee then the other, until his eyes were level with hers. For a long moment nothing happened. The fire crackled. Something inside the ruined pod popped and hissed. Her ears twitched, first one, then the other, like they were tracking sounds on separate channels. Then she made a noise, not the keen. Something softer, a chirping exhalation, and her grip on the object against her chest loosened just enough for him to see it. A figurine, carved from something dark and dense, small enough to fit in his palm. It depicted 2 figures intertwined, one larger, kneeling, one arm extended, one smaller, leaning into the shelter of that arm. The carving was old. The surfaces had been worn smooth by years of handling, the edges rounded by 10,000 touches, something abstract and clearly precious. He didn't reach for it, He didn't reach for anything. He just stayed where he was, knees in the scorched dirt, and let her look at him until her breathing slowed. That was how it started. She let him approach on the third attempt. The first time he moved toward her, she made a sound, a sharp, percussive click from somewhere deep in her throat, and every muscle locked. He stopped, backed up, waited. The second time she flinched but didn't click. The third time she watched his hands come forward and did nothing, and when his fingers closed gently around her upper arm, she exhaled a long, shaking breath that carried the held tension of days. He checked the leg first. Swollen around a joint he didn't recognize, not a knee, not an ankle, something in between with an additional axis of rotation that human anatomy didn't have. The tissue was hot to the touch, darkened to a bruised violet beneath the slate skin. She made a tight, high sound when he tested the joint's range, and he stopped immediately. He shrugged off his jacket and laid it on the ground. Then he knelt with his back to her and patted his shoulder. "Climb on." She stared at him. He repeated the gesture slower. She reached out and gripped his collar with one hand, then the other. He felt her weight shift, barely anything, light as a half-empty pack, hollow-boned or something analogous, and then she was on his back, her face pressed against his neck, the figurine digging into his shoulder blade through his shirt. He carried her back to the station. The station was built for function, not comfort. One sleeping quarter, one operations bay, one supply room, one lavatory that recycled everything with grim Terran efficiency. He cleared the cot in the supply room, laid out the cleanest blanket he had, and set her on it. She pulled her good leg up under her immediately, making herself as small as possible, back against the wall. He splinted the injured leg with what he had, packing foam, medical tape, a length of conduit as a brace. She watched every movement with those pulsing eyes and didn't make a sound. When he finished, she looked at the splint, then at him, and her ears slowly rose from their flattened position, not fully upright halfway, a shift he read as the difference between ready to bolt and willing to wait. He brought water. She looked at the cup for a long time before drinking, and when she did, she drank like someone who hadn't had water in days, fast, desperate, her thin throat working. He refilled the cup twice. Food was harder. He set out what he had: protein rations, dried fruit, a nutrient bar that tasted like pressed sawdust. She sniffed each one, ears moving in sequence. The dried fruit she ate. The rest she pushed away with one finger gently, as if trying not to offend. He sat on the floor across from her, his back against the supply shelf, and they looked at each other in the dim light of the station's emergency strips. "You came down hard," he said. He talked because silence felt like pressure, and she seemed to respond to the cadence of his voice even if the words meant nothing. "Your pod's in pieces. I don't know if anyone's coming for you, and I don't know if whoever's coming is someone you want to see." She tilted her head. One ear rotated forward, the other stayed where it was. "My name's Garrett." He touched his chest. "Garrett." She looked at where his hand rested. Then she looked at his face. Then very quietly she made a sound that was almost an attempt at the word, a soft, guttural approximation. "Garrett." Something shifted in his chest. An old mechanism, rusted over, turning for the first time in years. He nodded, close enough. That night she woke screaming. Not a human scream, a frequency that vibrated the water in his cup on the console and made the instruments in the operations bay hum in sympathy. He was at the supply room door in 4 steps, expecting blood, expecting an intruder, expecting the worst. She was sitting upright on the cot, the blanket twisted around her good leg, her eyes wide and unseeing, her mouth open on a sound that was no longer coming out. Her ears were flat, trembling. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the door, as if she didn't know where she was. Then her gaze found him, and something settled, a recognition that pulled her back from wherever she'd gone. He sat on the floor beside the cot. He didn't touch her. He just sat close enough for her to see, and after a while her breathing slowed and her ears came up halfway and she lay back down. She didn't sleep again. Neither did he. They stayed like that until the sky began to lighten. Sometime in the quiet hours before dawn, she began to hum. Low, soft, a vibration more felt than heard. Not distress, something else. Something that sounded old, practiced, the kind of sound a child makes when repeating a comfort given by someone who is no longer there to give it. A lullaby learned from someone else's voice. Garrett sat very still and let the sound fill the supply room. His arm ached from holding position. He didn't move it. He hadn't thought about the bridge in 3 years. The Orphan River crossing on Helios IV, 47 tons of prefab steel and 26 people standing on it when the pylons gave way. He'd signed the load certification. The metallurgy reports were supposed to be sound. They weren't. 26 people in the river, 13 recoverable, and Garrett standing on the bank with a certification form in his hand, and a sound in his ears. He would hear for the rest of his life steel bending past its tolerance, followed by the silence of people falling too fast to scream. The board cleared him. Metallurgy fault, not engineering. But he'd stopped signing certifications after that, stopped wanting to be anywhere that his decisions carried weight. The step was the absence of weight. The humming child on the cot behind him was placing weight on every wall he had. In the morning she ate without prompting, for the first time reached for the dried fruit before he'd finished setting it out. She ate 4 pieces, which was 3 more than the day before. She also drank a full cup of water without hesitating, and when she offered a second cup, she took it with a chirp that had the cadence of thank you. She discovered the operations bay by noon. He found her sitting in front of the station's main console, her good leg folded beneath her, her injured leg extended on a padding of blankets she'd arranged herself. She was studying the readouts with an intensity that looked almost professional, one ear forward, the other back. When he approached, she pointed at the console and made a questioning sound. Weather station, he said, pointing to one screen. Power grid. He pointed to another. Comms array, a third. She touched the weather screen with one fingertip. The display shifted under her touch. She'd found the input layer, scrolled through 3 menus in the space of a breath, and pulled up the atmospheric pressure history before he could reach over to help. She studied the graph, ears moving, and made a low sound that he interpreted as satisfaction. Not a child who'd been kept ignorant then. Someone had taught her to read instruments, someone with access to technology at least as sophisticated as this. The figurine sat in her lap while she worked. She hadn't set it down once since he'd found her. Kes was learning his words, not many but the critical ones. Water water, the T softened to a click. Food fa, just the first syllable, but she pointed at the rations when she said it. No, go, stay. She learned stay on the second night, when he'd gone outside to check the perimeter, and she'd appeared in the station doorway, balanced on her good leg, ears flat, her expression clarifying the meaning of a word he hadn't needed to teach her. Don't leave. He was learning her sounds too. The ear positions were a language. Flat meant fear. Half up meant cautious engagement, full upright meant trust. The chirp had 6 variations he could distinguish: greeting, acknowledgement, surprise, amusement, discomfort, and one she used only when looking at the figurine. The hum had 3 registers: low for danger awareness, mid-range for contentment, high for pain. She produced the danger hum whenever the ship appeared on the scanner. On the 3rd morning, she learned his name properly. Not Garrett anymore, Garrett. Both syllables distinct, the hard consonant still softened but recognizable. She said it while looking at his face, testing the shape of it in her mouth, and when she got it right her ears did the full upright flutter and she made the amusement chirp. He taught her his name. She taught him hers. She also taught him the word for water in her language, a clicking 2-syllable sound that he butchered completely on the first 3 attempts. She watched his mouth with clinical attention, then reached out and touched his jaw, repositioning it. When he tried again and got closer, she made the satisfaction flutter and patted his arm once. A pigeon was forming between them. Crude, gestural, built on a foundation of pointing and miming and the occasional breakthrough of a word that crossed the gap. It was enough. It was enough to understand that, when she pointed at the door and then at herself, she was offering to leave. It was enough to understand that, when she touched the back of his hand with 2 fingertips and said a word he didn't know, she was telling him something that mattered. 3 days in, she had a name for him, and he had a problem. She called him Garrett with increasing confidence, the chirping quality of her voice softening the consonants into something that sounded almost affectionate. He called her Kess, because on the second day she had pointed to herself and made a sound that sat somewhere between a click and a sigh, and Kess was the closest his tongue could manage. The problem was the signal. He'd gone back to the crash site on the first morning, partly to salvage what he could and partly to check for a beacon. He found one, a small device embedded in the pod's hull, still pulsing with a faint blue light. It was broadcasting. He could hear it on the station's wideband receiver, a repeating pattern that cut through the static like a blade. Someone was going to come for that signal. The question was who, and the answer arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. A ship, not a human ship. It entered atmosphere over the western mountains, a sleek angular thing that moved without engine noise, its hull the same ceramic copper material as Kess's pod. It flew a slow, deliberate pattern over the steppe, quartering the terrain in a search grid. Military precision, or something functionally identical. Garrett watched it from the station's observation window, and beside him Kess watched too. The sound she made was not chirping. It was a low, vibrating hum that resonated in her chest, and her ears went flat, and her fingers found the figurine and gripped it until her knuckles went white. He didn't need a translator to understand. Whatever was in that ship, she was not glad to see it. He killed the beacon within the hour, pulled it from the wreckage, found the emitter node, and crushed it with a rock. The blue light died. He scattered the pod fragments with the station's small utility vehicle, dragging them into the scrub ravines, where the mineral deposits would mask any residual energy signature. He walked a false trail 300 meters into the scrub, heading north before doubling back on exposed rock that held no prints. Back at the station, he scrubbed the wideband receiver and recalibrated it to monitor the ship's movements. It was still searching, methodical, patient, covering ground in tight passes. That night, while Kess slept in the supply room with the bolt drawn, Garrett sat at the operations console and ran the numbers. The station had no weapon systems, no defensive capability beyond reinforced walls designed for dust storms, not hostile contact. The communications array could reach Terran Frontier Command, but the nearest relay was a 14-hour signal bounce, and even if someone answered immediately, it would be days before any response arrived in physical form. He drafted a message to Frontier Command, short, factual, requesting guidance on contact protocol. He looked at it for a long time, then he deleted it. Contact protocol meant the Frontier Corps showing up with a diplomatic shuttle and procedures that would end with Kess transferred to an interspecies processing facility on Kepler Station, a case file, a biometric record, a question for bureaucrats who would debate jurisdiction while she sat in a holding suite with nothing familiar except the figurine she wouldn't let go of. The system wasn't cruel. It was just large and slow and utterly without the capacity to kneel. He went to check on Kess. She was awake, sitting up, ears half raised, watching the door. When he opened it, she made the chirping sound and patted the edge of the cot, an invitation. He sat. She leaned against his arm, her slight weight barely registering against his shoulder, and closed her eyes. The next morning, Kess was watching him from the operations bay doorway when the ship's position shifted on the scanner. It had moved to the area where he'd scattered the pod fragments. He watched the readout, jaw tight. Kess made a deliberate 2-note call. When he looked up, she was pointing at the scanner's control panel, at a specific junction on the wiring harness he'd been considering for the signal blanket. She tapped it twice, drew a line in the air tracing a path to the station's grounding plate, and stared at him with the patience of someone teaching. He followed her instruction. The signal blanket tightened from a diffuse wash to a focused cone that scattered any electromagnetic scan across the step's natural magnetic anomalies. She had known. He looked at her with new eyes. She looked back with those enormous ones, and her ears did a quick flutter that he was starting to read as amusement. She said something in her own language, a string of syllables that had the cadence of a statement, not a question. Then she pointed at herself, and then at the door, and the meaning was clear. She was offering to leave, to draw them away, to save him the trouble. Garrett crouched until he was at her eye level. "No," he said. One word. She understood it. Her ears twitched, and something moved behind those enormous eyes, confusion, maybe, or the particular bewilderment of a creature who had not expected that answer. He picked her up and carried her back to the supply room. She was lighter than before, if that was possible. She needed to eat more. The dried fruit was running low. He began to plan. The ship made its first ground approach on the fourth evening. The signal blanket was running on the station's power grid, and the step's natural iron deposits thickened the interference. In theory, the station would read as just another geological feature to anyone scanning from above. Garrett watched the ship settle 4 kilometers to the south, near the mouth of the canyon where he sourced his water. Cold blue-white lights cut through the dusk like surgical instruments. 3 figures emerged. Tall, moving with fluid precision that suggested a skeletal structure very different from human. They fanned out along the canyon rim, scanning. Through the survey scope's enhanced optics, he watched one of the figures kneel beside a boot print in the soft earth at the edge of the burn scar. It placed a device against the impression and held it there for several seconds. Then it stood and looked north, directly north, not toward the station, toward the false trail he'd laid through the scrub. The figure gestured to the others. They conferred, then moved north, following the ghost. Garrett exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Then the third figure broke from the group and began a slow traverse along the ridge, scanning independently. They were hedging. One team followed the ghost, while the third covered the possibility that it was exactly that. The lone figure swept its scanner in a slow arc that passed directly over the station's position. Kept moving, the signal blanket it held. The step's iron deposits had done the rest. The reprieve would last hours, not days, but hours were enough. Kess was in the supply room with the bolt drawn. He knocked twice. The bolt slid back. She was sitting in the dark, the figurine in her lap, her eyes reflecting the faint corridor light like twin moons. "We need to move," he said. He mimed walking with 2 fingers, then pointed at the northern horizon. The mountains. Rough country, hard to search, full of caves and ravines. She looked at his hand, then she held up the figurine. In the dim light, the 2 carved figures were clearly visible, the larger one kneeling, bearing the weight of the smaller. She pressed it against her chest and made the vibrating hum, softer this time, and her eyes closed. She looked like exactly what she was. A child, a very young one, holding the only piece of home she had left. Garrett Coyle had been alone on this step for 11 months. He had chosen it. He had wanted the silence, the distance, the absence of anything that required him to care about something beyond the next maintenance report. He had wanted to be a man with no stakes in anything. He looked at this child and felt the full weight of how completely that plan had failed. "First light," he said. "We go at first light." He spent the rest of the night preparing. The station had a small utility locker with emergency supplies, a thermal tarp, a hand-crank torch, 20 meters of synthetic cord, water purification tabs. He packed them alongside the food, the medical kit, and the density scanner. He broke down the signal blanket's portable components and rigged them to run on the scanner's battery, so they'd have electronic cover even after they left the station's power grid behind. Kess watched him pack from the doorway. She didn't speak. She watched with the focused attention of someone who needed to know that this human was not doing what every other protector in her short life had done. He was not packing to send her away. He was packing to go with her. At one point she held the figurine out, not offering, showing. She touched the larger figure and pointed at him, touched the smaller figure and pointed at herself. The expression on her face was the most serious he had seen on anyone that young. He nodded. She pulled the figurine back against her chest, and her ears came up one notch higher. They moved north through the pre-dawn dark, Garrett carrying Kes on his back in a makeshift harness he'd rigged from cargo straps. She clung to him with surprising grip strength, her thin arms locked around his shoulders, the figurine pressed between her chest and his back. Her injured leg jutted out at an angle inside its splint, and every time the terrain jarred them, she made a small, tight sound that she immediately swallowed. He carried a pack with 3 days of water, the remaining dried fruit, the medical kit, the density scanner running on its internal battery, and the rifle. The rifle was chemical propellant, subsonic, a relic by galactic standards. He suspected it would bounce off the searcher's armor like thrown gravel. He carried it anyway, because leaving it felt worse than the weight. The steppe gave way to broken ground within 2 hours. Basalt ridges, crumbling arroyos, the first scrubby trees clinging to fissures in the rock. The mountains proper began at the head of a long alluvial slope, and by mid-morning they were climbing. Kes was quiet on his back. She pressed her face against his shoulder blade and breathed in a rhythm that he recognized after a while as deliberate. She was timing her breaths to his footsteps, syncing herself to his movement to reduce the jostling on her leg. It was so precisely calibrated that he stopped and turned his head to look at her. Her eyes were open, watching the terrain behind them, watching for pursuit. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. She'd been carried before by someone who'd taught her how to ride without adding to the carrier's burden. Someone who had needed to carry her through rough country, away from something. The figurine, the 2 carved figures, the larger bearing the smaller. Whoever had carried her before, they weren't carrying her now. He kept climbing. The terrain grew hostile past the first ridgeline. Loose scree fields that shifted under his boots, narrow ledges where one wrong step meant a fall neither of them would survive, chimneys of fractured basalt that funneled the wind into a constant roar. His left knee, the one that had been complaining since a bridge collapse in the core 12 years ago, sent sharp reports up his thigh with every downward step. He ignored it. Ignoring pain was a skill he'd had longer than the knee had been bad. The morning heated the rock until it shimmered. His water consumption was running too fast, the altitude was modest, but the air was dry, and carrying an extra 20 kilograms up a slope pulled water out of him faster than he'd planned for. He rationed, drank half what his body wanted. Gave Kes a full share each time, watching her drink with the same desperate efficiency she'd shown on the first night. Halfway across a particularly exposed traverse, a shelf of rock no wider than his boot, with a sheer drop on one side and a cliff face on the other, the ship passed overhead, low enough that the air displacement knocked loose a shower of pebbles from the cliff above. Garrett flattened himself against the rock face, one hand on Kes, the other gripping a handhold, and held his breath while the shadow swept over them. It passed, didn't circle, didn't slow. The density blanket held, or the mineral-rich rock obscured them, or the ship's sensors weren't calibrated for something as small as a man and a child pressed against a cliff face. He finished the traverse in 30 seconds flat, moving faster than safety allowed, Kes's fingers white on his collar. By noon they reached a shelf of rock overlooking the northern slope, and he set her down in the shade of an overhang while he glassed the terrain behind them with the survey scope. The steppe stretched out below, brown and flat and enormous. The station sat like a gray blister on the land. The ship was gone from the canyon. He swept the scope across every quadrant. Then he checked north and his stomach dropped. They'd moved the search grid. The ship was above the foothills, 8 kilometers out and closing, running the same quartering pattern. They'd figured out the direction. He looked at Kes. She was watching the sky, ears flat, and she said something quiet in her language that had the tone of someone who had expected this. "How badly do they want you?" he asked. She met his eyes. Hers were steady and old, too old for a face that young. She had seen people come for her before, and she had seen what happened to the people who stood in the way, and the look she gave him was the look of someone trying to tell him to set her down and walk the other direction. He shouldered the pack and picked her up. They went deeper into the mountains. The terrain grew wilder, fractured ridgelines, hanging valleys choked with scrub, chimneys of volcanic rock that funneled the wind into howling corridors. Kes clung to his back and said nothing, but her hand found his collar and gripped it, and when they reached a particularly treacherous descent, a loose scree field that dropped 200 meters to a valley floor, she pressed her face against his neck and made the humming sound, very low, barely audible over the wind. It vibrated against his skin like a second heartbeat. Beyond the scree field, the mountain opened into a hanging valley. At the far end, a cliff face riddled with dark openings. Caves. The caves found them before they found the caves. A fissure in the cliff face, barely wide enough for Garrett to pass through sideways, opened into a space that was cool and dry and large enough to stand in. Mineral deposits crusted the walls: iron, manganese, the heavy metals that made the steppes geology such a reliable scanner scrambler. In here, the density blanket was redundant. The mountain itself was a shield. He set Kes down on a flat ledge and checked her leg. The swelling had worsened from the climb. The skin around the joint was dark and hot, and when he touched it gently, she flinched, the first time she had flinched from his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at his face. Then she reached out and touched the back of his hand with 2 fingertips, a deliberate gesture, precise. Her skin was cool, smoother than human skin, and where she touched him he felt a faint tingling like a low-grade electrical current. She held the contact for 3 seconds. Then she withdrew, and her ears came up not halfway, but fully upright for the first time since he'd found her. She said a word. One word, spoken with the careful weight of someone using a term that mattered. He didn't know what it meant, but the way she said it, looking at him directly, ears high, the figurine resting in her lap rather than clutched against her chest, told him it was something she didn't say to many people. He nodded. "You too, kid." They waited out the afternoon. Garrett rationed the water and split the last of the dried fruit. Kes ate her half slowly, picking each piece apart with her thin fingers and studying it before placing it in her mouth. She offered him a piece back, holding it out on her open palm, and when he took it her ears did a quick flutter that might have been satisfaction. He took stock. 3 days of water left if he cut his own intake to survivable minimum. 1 day of food Kes would eat. The density scanner's battery would hold another 40 hours. The rifle had 17 rounds. The medical kit was half depleted. 17 rounds, 3 pursuers, a ship that could glass the mountainside from orbit if it chose to. The math hadn't changed, but neither had he. He used the remaining daylight to explore the cave network. It went deep, hundreds of meters of branching passages, some wide enough to drive the utility vehicle through, some barely shoulder width. The mineral deposits thickened as the passages descended, crusting the walls with dark crystalline formations that sparkled when the torch beam caught them. Iron, manganese, cobalt, the geological equivalent of a Faraday cage, scrambling any signal that tried to penetrate from outside. He found water, a seep at the back of a lower passage, trickling down a wall of dark stone into a natural basin. He tasted it, mineral-heavy, slightly bitter but drinkable. He filled every container he had. He found a second entrance, a narrow chimney that opened onto the far side of the ridge, screened by scrub brush, invisible from the air. An escape route if the main fissure was compromised. When he returned to the main chamber, Kes had done something while he was gone. She had taken the thermal tarp from his pack and arranged it across the ledge as a proper sleeping surface, tucking the edges under the stone with a precision that looked practiced. She had set out the water cups, the remaining food, and the medical kit in a neat line along the wall. She had organized the camp. She looked up when he entered and made the acknowledgement chirp. Her ears were at half-mast, cautious, not frightened. She patted the ledge beside her. He sat. She pointed at the passage he'd come from and made a questioning sound. "Water," he said, holding up the containers, "and another way out, in case we need one." She studied his face. Then she nodded, a human gesture she had learned from watching him, and her ears came up one more notch. He returned to the ledge later and found Kess had scratched marks into the cave wall with a shard of iron-rich stone. Not writing, drawing. Two figures side by side, one taller, one smaller with pointed ears. Between them, their hands were joined by a single line. Below the drawing, a caption in her script. She watched him look at it, ears at half-mast, waiting to see if she'd done something wrong. "That's us," he said. Her ears came up. She turned back to the wall and added broad strokes across the taller figure's shoulders, the harness he'd used to carry her. She was drawing him as she saw him, someone who carried things. She pressed her palm flat against the drawing and made the bond sound. Quiet, private, meant for the stone and for him and for no one else. He sat beside her, and she leaned against him, and they stayed that way while the cave dimmed around them. Outside, the ship passed twice. He heard it, not engine noise but a displacement of air, a pressure change that made his ears pop. Both times Kess went still, her breathing dropping so low he had to watch her chest to confirm she was still doing it. A survival instinct honed by repetition she had hidden before. She knew how to make herself small and silent and absent. Both times the ship moved on. As evening came, she began to hum. Not the fear hum, something else. A melody with structure, rising and falling in intervals that didn't match any human scale. It filled the cave with a sound that was more felt than heard, a vibration in the stone and in his ribcage. And it was, despite everything, beautiful. She was singing. A child alone in a cave, injured, hunted, holding a figurine of someone who was gone, singing. He listened and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not obligation, something fiercer and simpler. The same thing that had made him kneel in the scorched dirt on that first night, and kill the beacon, and carry her up a mountain with a bad knee and a 47-year-old spine. It didn't have a word. It was just the thing you did when a child was put in your hands and the universe suggested you hand her back. You didn't. On the 6th morning, she showed him the figurine. Not held it up, not clutched it, showed it, deliberately, placing it in his hands with a care that suggested she was lending him something irreplaceable. He looked at it in the pale light filtering through the fissure entrance. The two figures, carved from stone so dark it was almost black, dense and warm, with a grain that caught the light. The larger figure knelt, one arm extended. The smaller figure stood within the circle of that arm. On the base, a series of marks, not decoration, writing. Small, precise characters in a script he'd never seen. She touched the marks with her fingertip and said a word, then another, not his name, not the bond word, something else. Names, he realized, the names of the two carved figures. She touched the larger figure and said the first name. She touched the smaller figure and said the second name. Then she touched herself and said the second name again. The smaller figure was her. The larger figure was the person who had carried her before. The person whose name she said first, in a voice that carried the specific weight of someone naming the dead. He handed the figurine back. She pressed it against her sternum and closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently, repeating the name, keeping it alive in her mouth. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into the contact, the full slight weight of her pressing against his palm, and they sat like that while the morning light crept across the cave floor, and the wind outside carried the sound of the ship quartering the valley below them. On the 7th day, the searchers found the cave network. Garrett heard them before dawn, the displacement sound of their ship passing low overhead, close enough that dust sifted from the cave ceiling. Then silence. Then, distantly, clicking footsteps on stone, a rhythm too fast for two legs, too precise for anything casual. He woke Kess with a touch on her shoulder. Her eyes opened instantly, no grogginess, no confusion. She heard the footsteps and her ears went flat, and she reached for the figurine, and she was ready to move in the space of a single breath. The economy of her movements told the whole story. She had done this before, many times. They went deeper. The cave network branched and forked through the substrata, and Garrett chose passages by instinct and geology. Narrower was better. Denser rock was better. Anything that put more mineral interference between them and the scanners. Kess clung to his back with her breathing synced to his footsteps and didn't make a sound. The clicking followed, not close but persistent. The searchers had entered from a different access point and were working through the cave systematically, the same grid pattern they used in the air applied underground. Patient, thorough, the approach of someone who had never needed to rush because nothing had ever refused to be found. Garrett found a junction where 3 passages met and made a decision. He set Kess down in the narrowest of the 3, a crack barely wide enough for her shoulders, and pressed the density scanner into her hands. "Stay," he said. He held up his palm. "Stay here." Her eyes went wide. She grabbed his wrist. The grip was startlingly strong for something her size, and her ears disappeared into her hair. "I'm coming back," he said. He touched his chest, pointed at her, made a returning gesture. "Coming back." She held on for 3 more seconds. Then she released his wrist, and her hand went to the figurine, and she pressed it against her sternum with both palms, and she watched him go with those enormous eyes that held nothing back. He almost stopped, almost turned around and picked her up and took her with him, and to hell with tactics and choke points, and the cold arithmetic of 1 rifle against 3 armored searchers. The look on her face was the look of a child who had watched someone walk away before and had never seen them come back. He touched his chest. Then he pointed at her. Then he made the returning gesture 1 more time, slowly, deliberately, burning it into the air between them. She nodded. Her ears trembled but stayed up. He went. He took the rifle and went down the widest passage, the one that led back toward the entrance. He walked loudly, scuffed his boots, let his pack scrape the walls. He wanted the footsteps to converge on his noise rather than scatter through the network searching blind. The clicking changed pitch, faster, closer. They'd heard him. He found what he needed 200 meters in a bottleneck where the passage narrowed to a gap barely wider than his shoulders, with a sharp turn on the far side. A choke point. 1 direction of approach, no room to flank. He set up, back against the wall, rifle raised, breathing steady. 17 rounds. The first figure appeared in the passage ahead, silhouetted against the faint phosphorescent glow of the mineral deposits. Tall, taller than him by a head. It moved with fluid, inhuman precision, joints that bent in ways human joints didn't, a torso that seemed to rotate independently of the hips. Its skin was darker than Kess's, a deep charcoal, and its eyes had the same oversized structure but with a coldness to them, a professional dispassion. It wore light armor, the ceramic copper material of the pod, and carried a device in one hand that pulsed with familiar blue light. It saw him, it stopped. They looked at each other across the gap, 3 meters. At that range, the chemical propellant round would punch through light armor. He knew it. The figure seemed to know it too. "She stays," Garrett said. The figure tilted its head. It spoke a string of sharp, clipped syllables, not threatening in tone, instructive, the cadence of someone delivering information they considered self-evident. It raised the scanning device and pulsed the blue light past him, down the passage toward where Kess was hidden. He shifted his position, blocking the scan line with his body. A second figure appeared behind the first. This one carried a weapon sleek, compact, humming with blue energy. It raised the weapon to a ready position, not aimed at Garrett but not holstered either, an intermediate posture, a statement of capability. The first figure spoke again, slower, more deliberate, trying to communicate across the language barrier. It held up a device that projected a small holographic image, Kess's face, rendered in blue light, rotating slowly. It pointed at the image, then at the passage behind Garrett, and its meaning was blunt. "We know she's here. We have come for her. Step aside." A third figure appeared, all three armored, all three carrying technology that made his rifle look like a sharpened stick. The math was simple and final. Garrett didn't move. His finger stayed on the trigger, and his body stayed between them and the child. And his breathing stayed, even because combat engineers learned a long time ago that your breathing was the only thing you could control when everything else was gone. He thought about the sound she made when she sang in the cave, the weight of her on his back during the climb, the way she timed her breathing to his footsteps, the two-finger touch to the back of his hand, given with her ears up, the gesture that meant something no translator could have made clearer. The careful way she had organized the camp while he was exploring. The look on her face when she showed him the figurine and pointed at the larger figure, and then at him. He thought about 11 months of choosing emptiness, filing quarterly reports, maintaining solar arrays, the careful construction of a life without stakes, without weight, without anything that could be held or lost. He thought about how none of that had mattered the moment he knelt in the scorched dirt. "No," he said. The armed figure adjusted its weapon, not aiming but closer to aiming. A calibration. The first figure spoke rapidly to the second, its tone shifting, and the second figure lowered the weapon a fraction and replied with a curt syllable. A disagreement between them? Good. A unified front was harder to hold against than a cracking one. The lead figure tried once more. It held up the holographic image again, then pointed at itself, then made a broad sweeping gesture indicating the ship, the sky, the somewhere else where it intended to take her. Its tone shifted to something softer, almost conciliatory. It was trying to reason with him, to explain that it had authority and that this was, by any rational assessment, not a fight the human could win. Garrett understood all of it. His finger stayed on the trigger. Then behind him, the sound of stone scraping. Kess. She had not stayed. She had dragged herself out of the narrow crack and come down the passage toward him, pulling herself along the wall with her arms, the density scanner and the figurine clutched against her chest. Her splinted leg dragged behind her. Her ears were flat, but her chin was up. She came to a stop beside Garrett and looked at the figures in the passage. And she spoke. Not the chirp, not the hum, not the pigeon words she'd learned from him. Her own language, fluent and rapid, her thin voice carrying a force that didn't match her size. She spoke for nearly a minute without stopping, and her tone shifted 3 times from declarative to accusatory to something Garrett could only call invocation. She was citing something, quoting. Her hand found the figurine and held it up, and the blue light from the scanning device caught the carved surface and illuminated the 2 intertwined figures, and the soldiers looked at the carving and went still. She stopped speaking. She reached out and touched the back of Garrett's hand with 2 fingertips, the bond gesture. Then she said the word, the one from the cave, the one she had given him with her ears fully up. She said it again, louder, directed at the soldiers. The lead figure took a step back, not from fear, from recognition. It knew the word. It knew what the gesture meant. Its head turned to the second soldier and a rapid exchange followed, voices low, tones uncertain. Kess spoke again, one sentence hard and clear with her hand still on Garrett's. The armed soldier holstered its weapon, fully. The lead figure retracted the scanning device. It knelt slowly, deliberately, bringing itself to Kess's eye level the way Garrett had done on the first night. It spoke to her, quietly, a question. She answered. Then she looked at Garrett, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not triumph, but the intense, held-breath concentration of a child who had played her only card and was waiting to see if the table held. The lead figure looked at Garrett. It spoke a single phrase slowly, with the deliberate weight of formal address. The tone was unmistakable, a question. Do you accept what she has claimed? Garrett set the rifle down. He knelt beside Kess, his face level with hers. She was watching him with those enormous pulsing eyes, her hand still on his, her ears halfway up and trembling, not yet committed to hope. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She heard the words. She didn't understand all of them, but she understood enough. Her ears rose slowly, then all the way up, and her hand tightened on his, and the figurine pressed between their joined fingers, the carved stone warm against both their skins. The lead figure watched. Then it stood and spoke to the others, and the exchange that followed was rapid, clipped, the cadence of professionals recalculating. They looked at Kess, at Garrett, at the two-finger contact, and the bond claim made physical in the dim light of a cave on a world none of them had intended to visit. The lead figure spoke a final word, a decision. The weapons went down, not holstered, lowered, the posture of people who had stopped treating this as a recovery operation and started treating it as something else. Kess felt it. Her ears came up another fraction, and she made the chirping sound from the first night, the one that meant acknowledgement. She spoke again, one short phrase, and her voice was steady. The lead figure nodded. Then it stepped back into the passage, and the other two followed, and the clicking of their footsteps retreated through the cave network until the only sound was Garrett's breathing and the soft hum of Kess's chest against his arm. They came out of the caves into morning light, Garrett carrying Kess on his back one final time, the three soldiers walking behind at a distance that was deliberate, not pursuit, but escort. Their ship waited on the ridge above the tree line, its hull bright in the early sun. In the open air, the lead figure approached Garrett again. It carried a device that projected images, holographic, sharp, floating in the air like windows into another place. It showed him what Kess was. She was the surviving member of a transport attacked by raiders, her people's vessel, carrying families, struck while transiting the outer systems. The pod was an escape capsule, one of dozens scattered when the hull was breached. Most had been recovered. Kess's had tumbled through debris, been struck by shrapnel, and fallen through a gap in the recovery grid. Beacon damaged, trajectory carrying it into the gravity well of a minor Terran survey world nobody was watching. 7 days. She had been alone in that pod for 7 days before it fell. A child holding a carved figurine, waiting for a signal nobody was sending. He looked at Kess. She was looking at the images of other children who had been found, and her expression was not envy. It was relief. A child who had spent 7 days alone in a falling pod was glad the others had been found faster. Something in Garrett's chest closed like a fist. The bond word carried weight he was only beginning to understand. In Kess's people's framework, it created a tie between adoption and oath. Not given lightly, not taken back without the consent of both parties. She had looked at a human with a rifle and a splint made of packing foam, and decided he was the person she wanted to claim. They were offering a choice. Come with them to where her people were rebuilding, or stay, let her go. The bond word could be dissolved. Garrett looked at Kess. She was sitting on a rock beside him, the figurine in her pocket, her ears at half-mast. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the ground, her jaw tight, doing the thing he recognized from the first night, giving him the out, offering to walk away, bracing for the answer she expected. She expected him to stay. She expected every protector to be temporary. She expected the larger figure in the carving to set the smaller one down eventually, because that was what the galaxy had taught her. He walked to her. He knelt, one knee then the other, the same way he had that first night in the scorched dirt. Guess. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was holding it, the way a child holds something breakable, with both hands and visible effort. Garrett go, she asked. Garrett goes. He shook his head. He took her hand in both of his. His hands were rough, scarred, the hands of an engineer who had spent decades with tools and hard surfaces. Hers were small and cool and smooth, and they fit inside his like a key inside a lock that neither of them had known existed. Garrett stays, he said. Garrett goes with Kes. Her ears came up, slowly, trembling as if they weren't sure they were allowed. She made the bond sound, not the word this time, but the hum beneath it, the resonance that lived in the chest and the stone and the air. It filled the mountain morning, and Garrett felt it in his sternum, and it was the sound of something old being repaired. She pressed her forehead against his chest, small, fragile, alive. The figurine pressed against his ribs through her pocket, the carved figures warm with the heat of her body. He put his arms around her, carefully, the way you hold something that has been dropped too many times. He held on. The lead figure watched. Then it placed its hand over its own chest, spoke a single word and bowed its head, not a salute. Something older, a recognition of what it was seeing, a bond it had come to sever, which had proven to be the kind that doesn't sever. It turned toward the ship. The soldiers brought a medical device from the ship, compact, precise, pulsing with soft green light. They handed it to Garrett and showed him how to activate it against Kes's splinted leg. The green light spread through the swollen tissue like water through dry ground. Kes gasped, a sharp intake that became a sigh as the pain eased for the first time in 9 days. Her hand found his. She gripped it while the device worked, and her ears stayed up. And when the swelling visibly receded, she looked at her leg with an expression of quiet wonder. They stayed on the mountain for 2 more days, while the device finished its work. The soldiers maintained their distance, leaving supplies at the cave entrance each morning. On the second day, the lead figure came alone and spoke in a clear, measured voice. Kes translated, haltingly, using the pidgin they had built. A ship was coming from the settlement where the other transport survivors had been gathered. It would arrive the following day. There would be room for both of them. Kes looked at Garrett when she finished. Her expression was careful, controlled. She touched the back of his hand. "I'm not changing my mind," he said. Her ears trembled. Then they settled, fully upright, and she leaned against his arm the way she had that first night and closed her eyes. On the 9th morning, Kes walked. She stood up from the ledge, put weight on both legs, wobbled once and then stood steady. Her ears were fully up. Her eyes found his. She walked to him and pressed both palms flat against his chest, not the 2-finger touch, something bigger, more formal. She spoke the bond word again and followed it with 3 other words that had the cadence of a vow. He put his hands over hers. "I hear you." They walked down the mountain together, Garrett and Kes, side by side, her hand in his, her stride uneven but steady. The soldiers waited at the ship, and when they saw the human coming down the slope with the child, they stood aside. At the foot of the ramp, Garrett stopped. He looked back. The steps stretched out behind him, vast and brown and quiet. The station was a gray speck in the distance. 11 months of silence, quarterly reports nobody read, solar arrays and the determined absence of stakes. He thought about what he was leaving. A cot, a generator, a solar array that needed cleaning, the company of wind and mineral surveys, and the determined conviction that a man could subtract himself from the equation of other lives and call the remainder peace. He thought about what he was walking toward. A world he didn't know, among a species he didn't understand, bound by a word he couldn't pronounce to a child who weighed less than his pack and who had, in the space of 9 days, dismantled every wall he'd spent 11 months building. Kes tugged his hand. She pointed at the ship, then at him, then clasped her hands against her chest. the gesture she had made when she told the soldiers what he was. He squeezed her hand. "Yeah," he said, "let's go home." They walked up the ramp together, the larger figure and the smaller one, moving at the smaller one's pace, neither of them letting go. Overhead, the sky was wide and clear. Somewhere above it, among the stars Garrett Coyle had spent a lifetime avoiding, a place was waiting. Not the place he had chosen. The place that had chosen him, the way a child's hand finds yours in the dark and holds on with a grip that has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with trust. The ramp closed behind them. The mountain wind kept blowing across the empty steppe, and the station sat in its silence, waiting for a man who was not coming back.